Susannah Fisher, and I'm a principal research fellow at UCL. And I've been working on adaptation for almost 20 years now. And through that time, I've been working on both policy and practice. So um, after a kind of initial academic start, I spent quite a lot of time working with the International Institute for Environment Development and then with other organizations. And so really wanted to understand what adaptation was like, kind of doing on the ground and working alongside local and national governments. But then I kind of increasingly felt that action wasn't really going further or fast enough. And I thought that a better place to be able to work on that would be from the university. So I'm now currently at UCL, where I look at multilateral climate finance and how that helps us adapt to climate change in my academic day job.
So, did you feel that climate adaptation wasn't really getting the attention it deserves and needed, both from actually in the public sphere, but also from a policy level of approach?
Yeah, so I think the reason I set out to write this book was because I felt that adaptation actually is posing kind of quite big political questions for the types of futures
Mm,
that we're going to live under climate change. But these
mm,
questions are almost invisible in the public debate. If you go around and have a conversation at your friend's house, it's unlikely that coastal relocation is going to come up. But there are kind of really big issues facing us. So I don't want to minimize, of course, the importance of climate mitigation, and that has
mm,
been the dominant
mm,
international
mm,
effort and is also still the very best way to adapt to climate change is, of
mm.
course, to limit the damage that we do further. But unfortunately, because we're now in the situation where we have warmed enough that we're always going to have to adapt, that there's a certain amount of adaptation built into the system. So my interest really was to open up some of those questions to kind of show that adaptation isn't necessarily just continue doing the same thing that we've always done. Actually, the science shows us that the impacts are going to ask us to do things differently. And unless we kind of start talking about that and opening up the conversation, there's a risk that we're going to leave people behind in those processes.
A lot of people perhaps don't really know what's going to happen.
Actually, mainly the response I get is people are quite relieved to know
Mm.
that it's not going to be as bad as maybe we thought 10 or 15 years
Right.
ago.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
some of the response I've had in bookshops and things is people saying, oh gosh, well, it's good to hear that actually we are bending the curve. So I think a lot of the narrative about the kind of dystopias and apocalyptic
Mm.
futures, which was maybe when we were thinking we were heading towards 4 to 5 degrees, have really cut into public consciousness. And actually, I think there can be a bit of a message of hope that, according to current emission scenarios, we're heading towards 2.5, 2.8. I mean, it's certainly not enough and it's not a good place to be heading, but it is a different place from expecting a warming of 4.5 degrees. So I kind of think that people have internalized some of those dystopian futures. And also part of the story of adaptation to kind of gain public confidence has to be also about how can we live well with some of
Mm.
these impacts, and it's not going to be it doesn't have to be dystopian. We have to kind of build new futures, but we have to work towards that, or else we are kind of just letting impacts go out of our control.
Have
Mm-mm.
you looked at more like UK specific approach or a global approach to that in your book?
So the book is global, and partly because I felt that there were a set of challenges that cut across variety of places in the world. And of course, adaptation is context specific, it's local. But I think also the point of the book is to point out that that means that many of the solutions will be local. So it's not that I wanted to write a book saying this is the one way to do coastal
Yeah.
relocation.
Yeah.
It was to pose the question that across the world, we already see planned relocation, from the US to Fiji to Vietnam, we have the examples. And they pose similar questions, although contextually specific, around what it means to do that well in different places. And yeah, for example, the UK has got lots of fascinating adaptation questions. And that's something, I might look at in the future. But
Mm.
right now, the kind of attempt was to make a bigger argument to kind of look across adaptation and provide an overview, partly because, as you said, it's so, I think, a bit beyond the public consciousness right now that I wanted to kind of provide that state of the debate as a starting point.
Locally, should you even ensure homes built on floodplains should be allowed to build on floodplains, and those small island states in the Pacific who are going to be open, they now the whole legal debate about actually having the right of
Mm,
citizenship that people so that this is also happening from a legal point of view as well.
mm,
So that there's a
mm,
lot of different kind of sides to it, isn't there?
yeah. Yeah, because I think it poses very fundamental questions about some of the ways that we've organized our society and our economic systems. And once climate impacts slightly shift the geopolitics of that and how countries interrelate, I think it, provides a lot of different questions about how we can do things better, but also, like as you said, many levers of ways that we can look to make that change, like legal angles being one, using litigation, social movements being another, kind of research and policy being another, you know, because there's so many different things that we can do and we need to do. And so I don't think there's kind of one solution, but there's multiple ways we can try and influence the system to move in the direction of adaptation and mitigation.
In the public culture and social media driven stuff, it can be very hard to get like an accurate
Mm.
perception.
Specifically on climate related migration, I mean, there's a lot of numbers thrown around, but really they carry so many assumptions behind them. Like the envelope of numbers is so wide because obviously that depends on so many things. But I mean, the research to date really shows that lots of climate related movement is within countries. So whilst we
Mm.
do have this kind of media related discourse of, huge flows of people, that's not really borne out in reality by why and how people are moving right now. So people are moving, for example, if they're displaced from a flood or a drought, but then they're usually moving, within their own country, possibly from a rural area to an urban one. And also much migration is also happening, differently from the media narrative. It's either happening within countries or it might be happening seasonally, for laboring and then people come back. So I think there's quite a gap between the kind of media narrative of what this might look like and the way that's also been used to kind of create fear amongst people to the reality of the fact that people move for many different reasons in their life, and climate will become one of those factors that people will take into consideration, but it's not
Yeah,
necessarily going to lead to these huge cross-border flows that we see.
if you think migration is bad now,
Mm.
just wait to see what happens if you don't deal with climate.
What actually happens in terms of climate migration is an effect of both the impacts that people experience, but then the measures that are put in place to support them in place or in neighboring countries or regions, and then the policy opportunities that people have to make a safe and dignified retreat or move somewhere else. So it's an interaction of those factors. So I don't think that, I mean, as I understand it, the Danish angle with the sea level rise
Hmm.
is a bit beyond what the scientific projections are. I think with Nomad Century,
Yeah.
that is beyond the realms of what's
No,
been modeled.
no, so it's not a fiction book. I think it's important to say that it is like written at looking at analysis and stuff.
Oh no, Nomad Century, absolutely, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
That's based on the science. I meant the Danish
Yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah,
fiction drama.
yeah, exactly, yeah. And also there was like book a few years ago from the US fiction writer Minister of the Future, where he also had some
Mm,
very kind of extraordinary kind of heat wave events in India and stuff like that. I mean,
yes, yes,
so I think
yeah.
it is. I think obviously, I guess you should look at it from a point actually looking art and those like fiction to kind of communicate debate about issues, but actually
Mm.
you make sure that you address this is fiction. This is like this is like a fictional a prediction in a way.
Yeah, but I mean, as you said, that the other book we talked about is non-fiction. It's based on the
Yeah,
scientific research,
yeah,
so it's
yeah,
certainly within the bounds of
yeah.
possibility of the models. And when you combine it with, so there's other research looking at, for example, the safe climatic space and where we're able to grow food, because obviously you have to think about mobility decisions. It will be about a variety of things: the heat that people are experiencing, extreme events, also how they're able to sustain their livelihoods. Um, so I'd say that we're not, the way people move currently is not driven so much across borders by climate change, but that doesn't mean that that won't be the case in the future if impacts get really bad.
No, and it doesn't mean that obviously the thing about climate change and climate science is that you can never predict precisely what's going to happen. Now you could have like a
Yeah, of course.
significant
What about if there's a tipping point, for example? Then
yeah, and you had those
all
floods in
bets are
Spain.
off.
You had those floods in Spain last year that suddenly
Yeah.
came out of the blue, and then
Mm.
I think there was like a new report released last week or this week about some planetary boundaries.
Yes. Yeah.
New point has been breached and stuff. So it's obviously, as you say, it's
Mm.
also very country specific. You know,
Yes. Yeah.
you can't really make a generalized
Mm.
argument for that. And I guess it's also important just to clarify that scientists are not always 100% in agreement. So there's always like nuances, right? There's
Yes,
always the
yes,
divergence, Some might take a more conservative approach, some might take a bit more of opposite opposite approach, and it depends like
yeah,
what specific what specific they are studying and researching.
yes, exactly. There's a range of views on how many people will want to move and be able to move. And so I think we can't make an accurate prediction, but as
There's
you
also
say,
different type of models predictions, isn't there? Different type of models that you look at
yes,
like the three directions. There's the optimistic, then there's the middle ground, and then there's
exactly. So part of this will be a
the
function of the mitigation decisions as well. If we manage to maintain at 2 degrees, hopefully
yeah,
the impact will be a lot less significant.
yeah. So what is you might have answered this already, but what is
Mm.
the main objective with the book? Is it to get this like kickstart this debate and cite a little bit more?
Yeah, I think my main objective was to open up some of the conversations around adaptation, to kind of raise the focus on adaptation and the attention, but also to make the point that adaptation is going to have to be at a far, far greater scale than we have done so far. And so it's not just about continuing what we're doing so far, but really thinking about how we rework our systems to deal with the extent of climate risk and climate impacts that we're going to experience. And like taking that out of the corners of universities where I spend my time to engage with people who are actually facing these decisions already. And lots of people already are. So I think to
Yeah.
connect the dots also to show that, we're seeing this in Scotland, but we're also seeing it elsewhere, kind of helps people understand the bigger picture that they're part of.
Yeah, as like always, issues really. It's not only about deciding where to build and live or proofing houses to. It's all
Mm,
down to the fact actually what happened to biodiversity impact, what happened to the animals who can live here anymore,
yeah,
what's happened to the kind of food we should grow and can grow, or maybe something we shouldn't do that we are currently doing.
yeah, yeah, because the indirect impacts will also ricochet across the food system, as you said, biodiversity, um, international relations.
Because I think in the last couple of years we have some quite, I mean, this has been quite an extreme period of, well, in the UK, for instance, like I think there's been a lot of uh, from like grain stock, there's been a lot of yield losses and stuff like that, and
Mm,
I guess that could, in that essence, like a country where we basically 89% of the grain we grow is like maybe wheat, maybe
mm,
that causes everything, or maybe we should grow something where we don't have that many losses really, and something where we actually have to be a bit more resilient in terms of actually we don't just lose the majority of the stuff we grow because we have this bad. So something that actually, I guess, like you have diversity, isn't it? Like it's not a bit like
yeah, so
an economy is diverse, Then you also have a growth
mm,
system that where actually you don't like too much in some things because if that go away, then
yeah.
it's not a massive disaster, right?
Yeah, so that's a big thing within thinking about the resiliency of our food system is how do we, as you say, we're so heavily reliant now on a few crops and a few places that grow those
Mm.
crops. And so for national food security, we need to think about a range of crops and imports and trading relationships that cover different impacts so that we will be resilient to a drought in one area or a particular trading partner, no longer exporting for because there's been an extreme event. And that requires us to rethink really the way we manage these networks because obviously a driving force has been efficiency and like not having redundancy in the system because redundancy costs money. But actually having a bit of redundancy might be necessary for the years when, for example, if we had a multi-bread basket failure, when multiple sites are unable to grow core crops, then we need to have that bit of flex in the system. But kind of everything about the way we manage the system now has streamlined that resiliency and the redundancy out.
I guess
And
it
we
also,
see those. Sorry, I was going to
I
say we
guess it
see those
also,
same issues. You go.
sorry, I guess it also means that actually we can potentially, from a food point of view, we can grow things that we couldn't do before. For instance, like in the last decade, like um, wine growing or grape production
Yeah,
have become more frequent. I think I saw something out there that there's now who's also trialing growing rice crops in the UK. Right?
Right. Okay.
So it's
Yeah.
that
So
I
there's
guess that's
also
all
some.
these things,
Mm,
that's coming in, and it's like having, I guess, from your point of view, I guess it is having an open mind to it and actually just not be deadlocked in something, having to see what works and doesn't work.
yeah, and also, these can be quite culturally difficult decisions. Like people might be really invested in what they have as their staple crop. They might not be open to wine grown in England. So,
Yeah, yeah.
it's not easy to just switch from one staple crop to another. And so that also requires us to kind of work with governments, think about incentives, or work with kind of, local community groups to think like what is attractive about this food substance that might be able to be found in another one.
I guess it comes on sentimental thing of things. I guess like I said as well about where we live.
Mm,
So people have a sentimental about I want to live near the coast, and you
mm,
have
mm,
coastal
mm,
erosion, and you have like a
mm,
cliff that's like it's not safe
mm,
anymore.
mm,
So it's
mm,
all
mm.
these. I guess it's all these things that has to be um it has to be kind of debated, and it not only kind I guess on a policy level, but actually something where you kind of include citizens in the decision making process.
Yeah, it's about people's values as well. So you might really value living by the sea, and that's an important part of who you are.
Yeah.
But then you may only also be willing to accept a certain level of risk, and that risk might be different for different people. Some people might be okay with accepting that you'll get flooded, once every 10 years, but you'll kind of adapt your house for that. Other people would feel that was unacceptable. So in some ways, the hard limits are not necessarily as hard as we think because they are partly about what people are willing to accept and the trade-offs that they want to make. But the problem really gets when everything can't be an individual decision because, for
Mm.
example, if you have people living in a coast, you need to provide services for them, roads, electricity, all of that, utilities. And there comes a point where if you've got some people moving away and some people staying,
Yeah.
it becomes very difficult to continue to maintain. So there are obviously public
Mm. Mm.
goods decisions as well about
Yeah.
when a government should continue to support a settlement in a
Mm.
coast, for example, or
Mm.
when they might need to say, as they've done in this country with the shoreline management plans, that we're moving towards retreating or realigning in those areas. And of course, that's very difficult because nobody wants to be realigned.
No, so I guess that's those two decisions. That's the one of actually what do we do with existing people, but how can we also set frameworks for actually
Mm,
we do things differently. We don't we once we deal with people who are there, but we make sure that actually we future proof where we build new homes and so where people can live.
mm,
In terms of so looking at climate adaptation, is it divided up into certain kind of areas? I know we talked about a little bit about energy, a bit about food. Is it
mm.
categorized into different kind of sub areas of what it impacts?
Sorry, I don't quite understand your question.
So if you
Adaptation.
say you have
Mm,
like one area of food, then you have
mm,
one area energy, maybe something about infrastructure. Is it
mm,
are you looking at or are you looking at actually the different kind of sector of society, how it's divided up, that
mm.
actually how all those areas impacts are impacted by adapt climate impacts and therefore you need to future-proof those areas for climate change, if that makes
So,
sense.
I mean, I don't fully understand the question still. Sorry.
No, so if you say that, for instance, this is the risk we know
Yeah.
that food production
Mm,
plays in a climate change, a climate
mm,
risk, this is the risk to the energy sector.
mm,
So is it being looked at the different sectors in a country,
mm,
how they individually
mm.
are impacted by that, and therefore
Yes.
where do you focus the most of energy?
Yeah, so I mean, when a country looks to do their adaptation plan, they'll look across all of their sectors and do a national planning process to see how climate impacts will affect, as you say, like their energy supply,
Hmm.
agriculture, infrastructure, human settlements, water supply and availability, um, coastal planning. So there'll be a sectoral approach at that level, which will look at impacts across everything. The approach that I took in the book, though, was I looked at that initially, but then what I actually wanted to do was to kind of elevate to the places which I thought were going to be the most challenging in terms of systems. So I think in
Hmm.
some areas it's quite clear what we need to do to adapt. For example, with road infrastructure, there's a kind of series of technical changes that we need to make those surfaces more resilient to extreme heat and to make sure they don't get flooded, etc. But I don't think they raise kind of primary political questions, whereas I think some of the other ways impacts will fall will really pose much more fundamental questions. So what I was trying to do in the book was to identify those areas where I really felt that the kind of hard political choices were going to come from. And so I identified those as being around mobility, so how people move in different ways,
Yeah.
food, yeah, relationships between people and nature.
Mhm. Yeah, I
But
think
for example, yeah, sorry, you
no,
go.
go on, carry on.
I was going to say, I think nature is often kind of left out of those
Mm.
conversations because until recently, biodiversity has very much been its own separate agenda. And it's really now that people are trying to bring those together and realizing like how much both ecosystems, but also the kind of breadth of species that we have is so important also for adapting to the climate crisis.
Yeah, I think I don't want to dwell on it, but one thing I took from the Danish TV series was actually
Mm. I
something I
obviously need to
never,
watch this series.
yeah,
I've
something
heard
I never,
about it, but I've
no,
not
no,
watched
but
it.
no, but something I never really is on iPlayer. Something I never really
Great.
thought about before. I like, but I've been not taught and written a lot of stuff about adaptation, but I never really thought about the value of identity and
Mm,
the natural feeling kind of thing. This is where I belong, and
mm,
of course we as well company now really have to think about that in a way. But
mm,
and what does it mean? What does a nationalistic identity mean? What does it mean that actually
mm,
you support sports teams, national team from the country
mm,
where you live? So
mm,
this is these really and when you talk about nature, it can also be that actually even as you move from one place to another, then you might live nearby a beach you love or a forest that you have really close
mm,
bonds with. So that whole thing about
mm.
belonging and identity, I think
Yeah.
that's a really interesting kind of narrative, and I think it's something that we probably should have more, but also people how they could connect to the issue better and actually have
Mm,
because everyone has like a local community in some way that they feel a belong to. Like, at least most people have, and stuff like that.
mm,
And the whole idea about that whole protectionism curve you have across that and that'll actually
mm,
get yourself going, more than anything. Like let's say like your
mm,
the local community center, the local school are impacted from
mm,
floods, like and
mm.
that'll really I think it'll fire up people in a whole different way.
Yeah, yeah, to make it local to their lives, I think is one
Yeah.
of the ways to make the adaptation agenda feel real. But I also wanted to touch on what you were saying about place-based attachment, which is kind of
Mm.
how we were talking about it in the research literature. It's, like
Yeah.
as you say, like of course everybody is very embedded in a place that they call home. And so when
Mm.
we talk about these big statistics of potential migration, there's
Mm.
also a huge sense of loss about it. Like people would be losing their homes.
Yeah.
And particularly when we talk about the coral atolls, for example, which are facing very severe flooding, um, if those are seriously kind of going to be have a lot of out migration, then there's a very serious loss of national identity, of citizenship, of language, of all kinds of things that need to be recognized.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where these are these big global conversations need to happen right
Mm,
on UN level and other levels,
mm,
that actually like if you need someone who has to replicate somewhere else, um, but how do they then keep their national identity? Come back to the national identity. Like
mm,
if you we can't unplay how important it is to people, we can all go and say, oh, those are nationalist elements, it's kind of a bit of a top, but to
mm.
a certain degree, we already all of us has a certain sense of that. It might not be the
Yeah,
sense that we
yeah.
think is portrayed in the media
Mm.
and so on. So that perhaps also is a valid kind of thing to reflect on. Um,
Yeah, and I think, if we think about people's decisions to move or if they're forced to move, they can be temporary or permanent. So we
mm,
might be thinking more of a model
yeah,
where people are moving for some time, but they're always retaining that sense of national identity and coming back to the place
mm,
that they call home. But again, going in and out. So we could look at a more fluid model, which of course we see in practice in many places where people will go for seasonal migration for labor and then they'll come back. So they're kind of maintaining a sense of home. whilst also moving for a variety of reasons. So, if we can have more flexible migration agreements that allow that kind of movement, that would allow people to hold a sense of place as well as kind of respond to the climate impacts and the challenges that they pose.
Yeah, that's interesting. It makes me think about technology in the sense of
Mm,
adaptation technology strategies. And I'm not just talking about
mm,
technology in building better house, but it's also actually what can technology do
mm,
to actually like better when you do have flooding, you know,
mm, mm,
better
mm.
system to actually clear the flooding as quick as possible. I know that in
Yeah.
Holland they do like they fill up whole like car parks with water and then they slowly release
Mm,
the water out
mm,
when the water
mm,
levels come down kind of
mm,
thing. So
mm, mm.
so that big grand scale technology, what in your research, what kind of role does that play?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it, as you say, there's some technologies that are available, but the question is, will we be able to meet the costs of them
Hmm.
everywhere? So, of course, water management in Holland is extremely advanced,
Yeah.
but the cost of it is very high. So it's not something that we would be able to roll out everywhere. But I think there are technologies, I think, in the food system, for example, which could emerge,
Hmm.
which might really help us, but we just don't know if they're going to come. So it always requires that question, how much will we rely on them? There's a lot of agricultural development going into drought resilient crop varieties, for
Yeah, yeah,
example,
yeah.
and what we can do about the kind of area of the world where the conditions are becoming more and more difficult for smallholder farmers.
I mean, you can
Like
also sorry, I
will
interrupted.
new
Carry on.
yeah, will new agricultural technologies kind of
Hmm.
move us beyond that problem because of new irrigation technologies, new kind of desalination technologies, new planting techniques. All of that offers a lot of opportunity, but we haven't yet seen, significant evidence that it can deliver. So I'm hopeful, and especially I think in the food sector, that's where,
Yeah.
we could just see a sudden innovation and could really kind of move things forward. But also, it's not only about growing conditions, and often they'll test these things in the lab. But then, for example, if the area is experiencing extreme heat, even if the
Yeah.
crops are going to be able to survive, people are still living in extreme heat. So there is also a question of kind of human comfort and mortality. And, it's
Yeah.
not just about the agricultural technology, it's also about the people who live there and how they can also have kind of sustainable lives.
I mean, also that you could look at think of a trade-off, doesn't it? So if you say that at least with current technology,
Mm,
building a desalination plant will have a huge energy footprint, and you got
yeah.
to look at actually the trade-offs and what you gain from it.
Mm, mm,
And I think what you say about water irrigation is that obviously we know that in the developed economies, we
mm,
have far more advanced irrigation technologies that we've been used for
mm,
decades
mm.
that the poorest country in the world doesn't have. So I guess it's
Yeah.
also about
Yeah.
actually having a even that's the whole thing about just transition as well. Having an
Mm,
even
yeah.
balance across the whole world before
Mm,
we even
mm,
start to to say
mm,
we have to get more better technologies, right?
mm,
And
mm.
and and it comes down to your earlier point about finance. It's all about finances. It's all about how you finance and that. It's all about what
Yeah.
countries benefit from that finance and where does it go, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I try and infuse some hope into these conversations
Yeah, 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 yeah.
because I think that concern as it all
Mm,
becomes very kind of gloom and
mm,
doom. And
mm.
I think, the position that I'm trying to come from is that lots of these futures are still open for citizens and voters and all of us to shape. And so, like, yes, we are facing down the barrel of quite significant climate impacts, but how we respond to them is still in our hands. So I think that's the kind of message I'd like to, try and get across, that there's a lot to do, but if we engage, we can move the needle in the right direction.
People want to watch your work and follow your work. Where can they find you?
They could find me on my Substack, Sink or Swim, and on LinkedIn.
What are you working on right now?
I'm working on the multilateral adaptation projects funded through the UN Climate Fund